Welcome to the Halacha podcast, Leman Yishmu, with Harav Yosef Yeshaya Braun, Mara Da'asra, and a member of the Crown Heights Based Din. This podcast is brought to you by the Ask the Rav platform, in partnership with Leman Yilmedu, the premier institute for practical halacha learning.
Okay, so one of the questions that we've received, which is extremely relevant to people that go on Mivtzoim and Mazak Yidin with putting on tefillin and saying Shema with him. And the problem is that people do not necessarily understand the language, nor do they understand the meaning of Shema. The Halacha in Shulchan Aruch is when it comes to Shema, one has to have kavanas halev, he needs to understand what he's saying. And the Halacha is if you don't have kavanah during Shema, you need to repeat Shema. There's also Halacha that if a person davens in another language, he has to understand the language. There's a question when it comes to Hebrew, if you need to understand, if you don't need to understand. But in Krias Shema, the Alter Rebbe paskins clearly that if a person doesn't understand, even in Hebrew, he's not yotza, he needs to understand and have kavanah with the very first passuk of Shema. And even if he knows that this is a mitzvah of Shema, and he knows that this is talking to Hashem, but if he doesn't understand the meaning of the words, then he's not yotza Shema. So how, when we do Mivtzoim, how do they yotza the mitzvah of Shema? Now the truth is, when people go to mivtza tefillin, they're not trying to get them to do the mitzvah of Shema. They're trying to get them to do the mitzvah of tefillin. Normally, the Shema they're saying is way after service man Krias Shema. They cannot be yotza Shema. It's past the time. It's the mitzvah esem and Torah of Shema. Unfortunately, is already over. It's a me'uvas lo yuchal liskan. It's a mistake that cannot be fixed. Once you miss the time, you can't fix that mitzvah. But we're trying to get them to do the mitzvah of tefillin. The real question is not so much about Mivtzoim. The question is when you're talking about Mekuravim, Balei Tshuva, they're starting to daven and they don't necessarily understand the meaning of the words. So we rely in that case on understanding the basic content, even if they don't understand the language. The Mishnah Berurah writes that it's not common that there should be a Jewish person that doesn't know the meaning of the very first passuk of Shema. And he writes that it seems to him that otherwise he's not Yotze. The reason he writes it seems to him, Lefia ni is Zaidy nida, implying that he's not clear about this. Isn't it a clear halacha? You have to understand the meaning of Shema. So perhaps the reason he's not clear about it because there is a Rabbi Kiva that says that you don't have to understand the words. You need to understand the basic idea that you're accepting upon yourself Oil Malchus Shemaim. So if that's the case, then the Mishnah Berurah is going along with this svara, unless the Mishnah Berurah is talking about the rest of Shema, because he himself writes that the first passuk almost everybody understands. There's also a Sefer Chassidim that writes that when it comes to Shema, it's better to say it in a language you understand. The expression "it's better to say it in a language you understand" implies that you don't have to understand. And again, the only explanation we can have is, of course, it's a chiyuv to understand Shema, but it's the basic idea, Mekabel al Malchus Shemayim. The Alter Rebbe writes, you need to understand Kavanas ha'inyan, she Kabel Malchus Shemayim ba'askamas halev. So we do have other places where it implies that it's important to understand the meaning of the actual words. It's not clear what level that is. What's this obligation of understanding the meaning of the words? In Krias Shema, when we talk about the mitzvah of Krias Shema, it's a mitzvah of Kriya, the actual Kriya, reading, you don't have to understand. It's just the issue of kavanah. When you talk about kavanah, it's likely that, according to the Alter Rebbe, this would be enough just to be mekabel all malchus shemaim, and it's not negated to understand the meaning of every single word. There are poskim and rishonim that imply it is important to understand the meaning of every single word, but obviously we're talking about the people who don't know, that I'm relying on this. Going back to the Mivtzoim case, so over there we're not trying to get them to do the mitzvah of Shema. We're just trying to get them to do the mitzvah of tefillin. Why are we saying Shema altogether, Mivtzoim? If a person misses the time of Shema, it's kekore b'Torah, just reading Torah. So this has nothing to do with mitzvah tefillin. Why are we getting them to do that? The answer is for that very reason. Because if a person missed out the zman Krias Shema, he should say the rest of the day kekore b'Torah, and he's mekayim a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. When a person says even one chapter of Shema of Torah in the morning and one chapter at night, just says the passuk of Shema Yisrael is mekayim mitzvah of Talmud Torah. We do it at the time when he puts on tefillin, so it shouldn't be made Eidish Sheker saying Shema without tefillin. So he does the Shema, does the tefillin, fulfilling the mitzvah of tefillin, fulfilling the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, but not fulfilling the mitzvah of Shema. Talking about Mivtzoim and how this associates with Shema, we sometimes say Shema with people on Mivtzoim, and they make a mistake. Now the halacha is that if a person makes a mistake, the Alter Rebbe writes that you have to go back to the beginning of the passuk. Whether if you made a mistake in a word, if you missed a passuk, you missed a word, or you missed a letter. So if you missed a letter, or you said it in a way that changes the meaning of the word, then it has to be corrected. Now imagine you would do this on Mivtzoim, and you tell them that you made a mistake, you have to go back to the beginning of the passuk. This could be pretty frustrating. So first of all, as we already established, usually during Mivtzoim, we're not trying to get them to do the mitzvah of Shema. It's past the zman Krishma usually, and therefore this whole halacha is not relevant. This is a halacha when it comes to the mitzvah of Shema. Here they're not doing the mitzvah of Shema, they're doing the mitzvah of tefillin, and we're just saying Shema together with the tefillin k'kreda b'Torah. But even arguably, if we would be saying with them Shema for the mitzvah of Shema, for that matter, skip Mivtzoim. A person is saying Shema himself and he makes a mistake. And this could be a problem if somebody has some aspect of OCD, because he obsesses about these things. Shema, there's a mitzvah to be medaktek ba'osi oiseha. This could be pretty frustrating for someone who's never sure if he made a mistake and it changes the meaning, doesn't change the meaning, he's always going to go back to the beginning of the passuk. That could be pretty extreme. So the answer to all of this is, it is very clear that when the Shulchan Aruch talks about if a person made a mistake and they skipped a word or they skipped a letter, they'd have to go back to the meaning of the passuk. It means they skipped and continued to the next item. When we talk about skipping a passuk, it's very clear. Skipping a passuk means they said passuk A, passuk 1, skip 2, and they started 3. Now, once you start 3, you need to go all the way back, and you can't now make up 2. You have to go back to 2 and then 3, because it has to be in order. Shema has to be said in order. You cannot say Shema lemafreya. So just like when we're talking about skipping a passuk, it means he went on to the next passuk. When we talk about skipping a word, skipping a letter, it means that he moved further. But if you still have the same word and you made a mistake, you could correct it immediately on the spot. When we read Shabbos Parsha Zachar, the Torah says, Timcha Zecher Amalek, there's 2 ways how to read that word, Zecher or Zecher. So our custom is, we just repeat the word, we say it one way, and then we say it another way. We don't go back to the beginning of the passuk to fix it. We just say it one after another. Now, truth to be told, that's not such a good example, because there's no significant change in the meaning, whether the word is Zecher or Zecher. There are those that want to explain that this might have a difference in meaning. Is it a word which is a nismach word, a word which goes together with another word, or it's a word that stands alone? There are other explanations about the difference. There's explanations of Chassidus. But according to the simple pshat, zecher mean the same exact thing. That's not such a good example, but we do have in the Megillah. In the Megillah we say lahashmed lareg olabed and vilareg olabed. Lareg and vilareg has a different meaning altogether. Certainly ishle amad bifnehem and ishle amad lifnehem. And we don't repeat the entire pasuk. Some people even have a meaning, they just repeat the word like we do in Parsha Zachar. Why is that? Because as long as you didn't move on to the next word, to the next item, there's really no reason you have to go back to the beginning of the pasuk. Some people make a mistake about this, and they have all kind of theories why we don't go back to the beginning of the pasuk. But in truth, even assuming that Krias Torah and Krias Megillah follows the same rules of Shema in this context, Hallel might follow those rules also. It's only when you moved on to the next link. But if you just said the word, you could just go back and repeat that word again. On top of all of that, there's a special chiddush of the Sefer Tehillah David, who argues strongly in 2 places in the Sefer that when the Alter Rebbe writes and other poskim write to go back to the beginning of the passuk is lav dafka. It's the beginning of the subject matter. So you can have a passuk that has 2 subjects in the same passuk. Ikshartam la'ois alidecha, ukshartam v'hoi l'tatafes beinenecha. And if you made a mistake, you have to go back to the beginning of the theme so the words should flow properly. And this is implied in Alter Rebbe elsewhere in Hilchos Krias Shema and Sin Mesamach Vav. This is debatable, but certainly that's another argument for leniency. And finally, an additional argument, this whole entire din, that if a person makes a mistake in a word, if you skip a passuk, that's a very clear halacha. You have to go back to the passuk that you skipped to say it in order. But when you skip a word, that you have to go back to the beginning of the passuk, The Alter Rebbe puts this in parentheses. And this is indeed a machlokes, it seems to be a machlokes rishonim. And if it's a parenthesis, then we know that means that Alter Rebbe had a doubt about it, or it's a chiddush of Alter Rebbe, but it seems like it's a suffix, it's a doubt, because it is a machlokes. There is a machlokes after all in this. And if we're, according to the primary opinion, the only part of Krishma which is minat Torah is the very first passuk, and once you're after the first passuk, it's already a question about a drabanan. And arguably, you could say, therefore, there's room for leniency, suffix drabanan l'kul. There's a question, if you have a call back to the beginning of the passuk, so there's certainly room for leniency in difficult cases. Normally, when it comes to Krishma, there's an argument that says that even the parts of Krishma that are the Rabbanan, we follow the rule of suffix l'chumra, but there's good reason over here to be lenient. So to summarize, in Mivtzoim, you certainly shouldn't worry about it. You're not trying to do the mitzvah of Krishma. When it happens to yourself, it's only when you move on to the next pasuk or to the... And even so, if it's two subjects in the pasuk, you don't have to go back to the beginning of the pasuk. And in extreme cases, there's room for leniency. I got a very interesting question this week. There was a grandfather that asked his grandchildren before he passed away, he doesn't want them ever to go back to Poland. I'm assuming the reason is because everything that happened during the Holocaust are terrible things. It's a terrible, cursed country in his mind, and he asked his grandchildren they should never return to Poland, and they have respect for their grandfather, and for many, many years they've honored this request. But they really want to go back now. Recently they started thinking maybe they want to travel, they want to go to the concentration camps, they want to go to other historic sites and check out the family's history and the family's past. But on the other hand, there's a directive that the grandfather gave them, they're very sensitive to what the grandfather told them, they don't want to go against what he said. So I know they asked the question with sensitivity. They could be told that maybe they don't have to listen, but they're not looking for that kind of answer. They want to know if there's a way, according to halacha, that they can make this trip and still be considered listening to the grandfather. That it's consistent with what he said. And the example they gave, there's certain cases where a kohen could go into a cemetery in a very certain way. Is there a way we could get them that they can go back to Poland? It's a very, very interesting question. So the first thing that occurred to me when I got this question was, we're talking over here about respecting a grandfather's wishes, which would go under the rule of kibbud avihem. Kibbud avihem, kibbud avihem, a grandfather. Now when it comes to kibbud avihem, there's a very strong argument, and Alter Rebbe argues this very strongly, and this is the position of the Marik, and many places say this, that kibbud avihem, honoring a father, is only something which directly benefits the father. The father asks the child, I don't want you to daven nusach hari, I want you to daven nusach Ashkenaz. Says the Alter Rebbe, you don't have to listen to him. There's nothing honoring him means giving him food, giving him drink, showing him respect, things that are directly relevant to him. So if a grandfather is asking his grandchildren that they shouldn't go to Poland, that has nothing to do with him. So there wouldn't be a chiv of kibbud avihem. It's the right thing to do, and certainly in a case where this could cause them a bizoin, there could be an issue also. That this loophole that kibbud avihem is not if it's directly negei l'hanasa shouldn't always be used, because that could create a machlokes, and sometimes it could be violating the isra of the halacha of moira'av. But they're being extremely sensitive, and they want to do it in a way that does respect the grandfather, and they're not asking for an answer that says no, you don't have to listen. So before we get to that, there's also a Sefer Chassidim that writes against the idea of making a cherem that people shouldn't go to a certain country. He says that could create a michshel, a stumbling block. Poskim talk about a cherem that possibly there exists some type of cherem of never going back to Spain. There's a big argument amongst historians. It's addressed also in Poskim. Is there such a cherem? Is there evidence of such a cherem? There's proof one way, proof another way. And I'm not going to go into the history debate right now whether such a cherem was ever enacted. But this is seriously addressed in many places. And some of them bring in relation to the possibly a cherem about not going back to Spain, the Sefer Chassidim that writes, you shouldn't make such a rule. Rabbanim shouldn't come out with such a decree because it could cause a stumbling block. They talk about whether they were talking about it after the World War II to make such a rule about Germany. There's a rumor that there was such a rule about York, not to go back to York because many Yidden were killed over there. But again, there's a Sefer Chassidim suggests you shouldn't make such rules. Now, whether such a cherem happened or not, again, this is a history question. But the passuk talk about, is there some type of heter? And part of the idea they talk about is, first of all, we don't know if there was such a chedim. It's a suffix in a chedim, and that itself might be room for leniency. How much is this chedim binding on the children and the grandchildren? And descendants and many descendants afterwards. But all of those arguments are all taken to the idea that maybe you don't have to listen to the chedim. And again, these grandchildren were looking for an approach that says, no, we don't want to say we don't have to listen. We're looking for a loophole, or maybe they don't want to use the word loophole. We're looking for a way that implies that we actually are doing something consistent with His will. So we have the Minchas Elazar has a tshuva. This tshuva of Minchas Elazar was lost. But the Darkei Chaim V'Sholem brings down from a Ksav Yad of Shal Teshuvas Minchas Elazar Chelik Vav. The later print was printed in Chelik Hey because a lot of his manuscripts were lost. He writes exactly this was a Chelik Vav Siman Lamed Daled, but again we don't have that. We don't even have the Chelik Hey. Is just a collection of things that were received, and he talks about the Schedim at length, and he writes that he provides various different conditions. Among them, he writes that if the government in Spain will give freedom, that people should act in a Torah mitzvah way publicly, they could act and they don't have to hide their Yiddishkeit. They will designate a special Beis HaKvaros for Yidden. Yidden could be buried in separate places, etc. Then he allows people to go back. And there was a Rav called Rav Bitzal Stern who brings this Minchas Elazar and modifies somewhat what he said, but comes with a similar idea. My grandfather in the Sefer Shanim Mitzion Halacha addresses this also, and he brings for the Munkach for the Minchas Elazar. And it seems to me that these conditions that the Minchas Elazar writes were not because, yes, if you want to go to a country, you need to know, this is a general rule, nothing to do with the Chedim. The Rambam says in Hilchos Days, you have to live only in a country where there's religious Jews, and there's a way to act religiously. That's not what they were talking about over there. They were talking about specifically in relation to the Chedim, that in such a case, where now there's an opportunity to live there in a kosher Jewish way, then there's room for leniency, whether for people that are descendants of those who lived originally in Spain, those who were exiled from Spain, or whether those who are not sure for them, they're their descendants. That's the gist of the heter. If circumstances in Poland have changed significantly from when that instruction was given, and now it's a place where Yidden live freely, it's not the same Poland anymore, it's only a temporary visit, so we can argue this would not be considered an absolute violation of the original instruction. Moving on to another question. Often, there are two Sefer Torah taken out. We just had two Sefer Torah for Parshas Shkolim. We're going to have again for Parshas Zachar. We're going to have for Parshas Parah and Parshas HaChodesh. And over Yom Tov we have two Sefer Torah. Now, one particular halacha that's found in the Rishonim and brought also in Shulchan Aruch, it originates from the Maram Rothenburg, that whenever there's two Sefer Torah taken out, when you pick up the first Sefer Torah and you do Hagbah on the first Sefer Torah, do not undress the second Sefer Torah and remove its mantle, its cover, and undo the gartel until you do Galila on the first Sefer Torah. We see this often in Shul. Somebody picks up the first Sefer Torah, does Hagbah, and then right away the Balkoyer or the Gab wants to start getting the show on the road, and he starts taking apart and removing the cover of the second Sefer Torah. So in Shulchan Aruch it says, Halacha in Shulchan Aruch, you're not supposed to do that. So the question is, when we say that you're not supposed to take apart the second Sefer open it, until Galila was done, what stage in Galila are we talking about? Does it mean you rolled up the Sefer Torah, you put on the gartel? In the Ashkenazi Sefer Torah, you roll it first, then you put on a gartel, and then you put a mantle on top of it, and then we often put on a crown on top of that. There's crowns on the Sefer Torah. Is the crown also included? So there's a Shal Tshuva Sefer from the Knesset HaGedolah, one of the early poskim brought regularly in the Magen Avram, continuously quotes from the Knesset HaGedolah. He wrote a Tshuva Sefer known sometimes as Shal Tshuva's Knesset HaGedolah, and other times it's referred to as Shal Tshuva's Boi Chai. And he writes, right in the beginning of the Sefer, he has, I believe, two Tshuvas on this topic, and he talks about a different related topic, and that is the din that you're not supposed to start the Haftorah until Galila was done. And he writes over there that you have to wait until the Sefer, a full entire Galila was done completely, mikoil v'koil, a cover was put in it, v'rimoinim. Rimoinim are those beautifications that are put in the Sefer Torah, and the Sefer Torah has to be put in its place. Niglal mikoil v'koil. There's another Shas Tshuva Sefer way later. I'm talking about an earlier passuk, not a much later passuk, Agudas Ezev Midbari, and he writes in those places or those times where people put ksarim v'ataris on the Sefer Torah, they need to wait until all the crowns are put on top of the Sefer Torah. Now they're addressing a different topic. They're addressing starting the Haftarah before Glila was done. And that actually is a machlokes. There are poskim, Rishonim already, that debate whether you need to wait till the entire Glila or only start Glila. We follow the position, that's the passuk, seems like what Rashi's opinion, and that's the passuk pshat in the Shulchan Aruch, and in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, that you need to wait until Glila has finished. And there's a letter of the Rebbe about this, why we are not lenient and we don't want to start Haftarah until Glila was finished. The Alter Rebbe explains this halacha, and he adds one word, a strong word, that the reason we don't want to start the Haftarah, it's very important for everybody to listen to Haftarah, because if you're busy with Glila, you can't pay attention, because you need to hear Lishmaya Ulahavin. You need to actually understand the Haftarah, which is a shtickl chiddush. So we're very particular, even when it comes to Haftarah, to wait until the entire Glila. Now with Haftarah, there are different opinions. When it comes to opening the second Sefer Torah, the Lashon and Poskim in the original Rishonim is, you have to wait sheyuglal b'mapa. Not just you rolled it up, you put the map in it, you put the cover, where the mappa means the garter, where the mappa means the cover, whatever mappa means. The Orchis Chaim, one of the Rishonim, when it comes to Haftarah, he brings two opinions. At what stage you can start Haftarah. But when it comes to opening the second sefer, when there's two Sefer Torah, he clearly writes B'mapa, and many other places can write the word B'mapa. Interesting, in the Mishnah Berurah, when it comes to Haftarah, he brings two opinions, and right afterwards, when it comes to opening a second sefer, he writes Sheyuglal B'mapa. Clearly, we have to wait for the mappa. Now, what's the reason you can't start the Haftarah before Glila? The pashto reason is because the person doing Glila will be busy, and he won't be able to focus on the Haftarah. But there are other reasons. Those other reasons might imply that you don't have to wait for the full Glila. But when it comes to two Sefer Torah, clearly the simple reason brought in the Lavush and the Knesset Gdola is in order to be able to hear the Krias Torah. Now, there is also another aspect, because if it's about being able to hear Krias Torah, so we'll open the second Sefer and wait. We won't start Kriya until they finish Glila. But that's also a problem, as the Knesset Gdola explains, because that's disrespectful. You're opening a Sefer Torah and leaving it like that, and not even starting Kriya. So it's a combination of both of those answers. Both of those ideas, the fact that you want the person doing Glila to be able to pay attention to Krias Torah, and you don't want to start and open up the Sefer Torah when you're not fully ready yet. And in the case of two Sefer Torah, it actually seems like it's a much bigger bizoin to open a Sefer Torah before you finish Glila than in the case of saying the Haftarah. In Haftarah, there are also other reasons for leniency. The Rebbe brings from the Shara Ephraim that in places where everybody says the Haftarah themselves, so there isn't this concern of people missing out and hearing the Haftarah. That wouldn't apply when it comes to two Sefer Torah, when it comes to Krias Torah. So clearly, without going into the entire Arichas, although there's one or two poskim that bring the heter, even with two Sefer Torah, that you don't have to wait for the full Glila. But from the Rishonim, it seems pretty clear that when it comes to two Sefer Torah, also need to have a full proper Glila, because it's a much more serious issue than Haftarah. And if we have Torah, we need to wait for the full Glila. Certainly, when it comes to two Sefer Torah and opening the second, we should wait until the entire Glila has concluded. People sometimes ask this question. It is halacha Shulchan Aruch, but not a very well-known halacha. The halacha says that a Baal Tshuva is not allowed to become a shliach tzibur, someone that did once an aveira, even if he did tshuva, someone that did aveiras in the past. So a person's a Baal Tshuva, did aveiras in the past, now he can become a shliach tzibur. So we don't seem to know about this, that we disqualify a Baal Tshuva from being a shliach tzibur. So the truth is that in Poskim there's some strong arguments that all these rules for Shliach Tzibur that are found in Shulchan Aruch, Siman Nun Gimel, Alter Rebbe brings it also, although it's found in Shulchan Aruch in the middle of Hilchos Birchas HaShacher, right before Hilchos Krias Shema, but it's not a halacha for the whole year, it's a halacha for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, for a Tainus Simmer. Some people want to argue that. Or maybe it's a halacha for a Shatz Kavua, for a fixed Shliach Tzibur, not an ad hoc Shliach Tzibur every day someone else goes to the Amud. even according to the opinions, which seems to be much more mainstream, these opinions, that this applies to the whole year and applies even for a temporary shliach tzibur, there's still the argument that when it says that even if he did tshuva, is because we don't know if he did. But if we know for a fact he did tshuva, then there wouldn't be any problem having him be a shliach tzibur. Now, on all these arguments, there are disagreements. There are persons that disagree. But the strongest argument is that all of these halachas do not apply to what we call a tinik shenishba. This applies to someone who was a rasha in the past and then he did tshuva. Someone who didn't have a proper upbringing, they're greater than anybody else. If you're looking really for a shliach tzibur, don't get a tzaddik gomer. Get a baal tshuva who is greater than a tzaddik, who never really did the wrong thing because it's not his fault he didn't have a proper education. All contemporary person agree that there's nothing holding back such a person from being a shliach tzibur. And indeed, this is the minig that the Baalei tshuva who are capable of being a shliach tzibur, they have a good voice, they have proper kavana, they know to carry a tune, they're shluch tzibur all the time. We were discussing in the past the halachas of changing places while eating, and this keeps on bringing in more and more questions that are coming up based on that. I want to clarify those halachas very, very clearly. And perhaps in the previous episodes, maybe some of this was not so clear. If a person is eating a food, and the bracha achrona for that food is ber nefashos, and he goes from one room to the next, according to the strict halacha, he's supposed to make a new bracha before you're going to eat in the next room. Unless you had das, unless you had in mind, when you said your bracha rishona, that you're going to go to the other room. You're supposed to have in mind, b'shas habracha. B'shas habracha, you're making a bracha, no, I'm planning to go somewhere else. Now, the problem is that today's day and age is a very difficult halacha for people to accept. It's very common that people move around while eating. The best solution is you should always bear in mind, whenever you make a bracha before eating, that you might go into another room. And therefore, you'll avoid the issue of whether you have to make another bracha or you don't have to make another bracha. Important clarification over here. When going mibayis lechotzer, when going from a house into a yard, then you need to make a new bracha, even if you can intended to continue and go out and continue to eat there. The same thing is mibayis lebayis. You're going from one house to another house. You have to make a new bracha, even if das only helps going micheder lecheder. So the simple solution, if a person is in doubt whether he needs to make a new bracha or not, the simple solution is better to make a bracha achrona first, and then you'll make a new bracha. Now, we don't just stop make a bracha achrona. This is called a bracha she'ena tzaricha, an unnecessary blessing. But if you want to avoid a shaila, if you have to make a new bracha or not, so when you're making a bracha, in order to avoid a shaila, it's not called a bracha she'ena tzaricha, as mentioned in many places. It is a lot of differences of opinion what means mibayis lechotzer. It seems like from the strict halacha that if as soon as you're not under cover, you're going out of the house and now you're not covered by the ceiling and you're open to the sky, that's already called mibayis lechotzer. If you're going mibayis lebayis, that means going from one house to another house. And there's this whole discussion when it comes to sukkahs, when you're going from your house to the sukkah. If you have to, between your house and the sukkah there's a space, that might be considered mibayis lechotzer. There's a special halacha if a person sees the original area, that's a whole other halacha. If you could see the original area, the second area, then you wouldn't have to make a new bracha. The Shulchan says you don't have to see the whole area from the second place, the first area where you ate, even if you see part of the area within Dal Damas around. So I'm just mentioning that just to make sure that people are aware of this. Some people suggest to make such a stipulation once for a person's entire lifetime, but it's not clear that such a thing would work. Some people suggest that maybe every year make the stipulation again. So make a stipulation that when every time you're making a bracha, you're planning to move to another room. But it's best to do it every single time without going into any shilas. I'll just wrap up with one very interesting thing. In Rambam, in one of the recent days of Rambam, we learned a halacha that if a man was told by doctors that his only cure is to be with another woman, or even just to see another woman undressed, etc., then it's one of those things that a person has to be meis nefesh, yiharig v'al yavid. There's 3 avedas that a person's supposed to give their life up, and one of the avedas is aveda zara, shrichas dam. One of the avedas is gili arayis. And even though we're not talking over here directly about gili arayis, and it says in the halacha, it says that even if we're just telling him let the woman just stand ma'achore ageder. Let her just stand behind a fence. Even that is a reason that he should not. That should also not be done, and he should give his life up for that. That's the lashon in this halacha. Even if we know that because of that he's going to die, because the doctors say there's no cure for him. He'll just talk to her. All they want him is to talk to ma'achore ageder. Now, I discovered a very interesting thing about this halacha, and I asked around a few people, and then I realized this is a heavy debate. What does the definition of the words ma'achore hageder mean? Ma'achore hageder means that he's on one side of the fence, and she's on the other side of the fence. That's how most people, when they learn Rambam, and that's how a lot of the modern-day Rambams interpret that he doesn't see her. She's behind the fence. What could be wrong with talking to a woman who's behind the fence? The very fact that she's not dressed makes his mind be involved in a taiva. That's one pshat. Another pshat ma'achore hageder is they're both behind the fence. So what's pshat behind the fence? The word ma'achore hageder in halacha, in Chazal, mean in a hidden spot. So he wants to talk to her in a place which is a hidden spot where nobody's around, which is an issue of yichud. So we're saying that he has to be moiser nefesh, not to talk to her ma'achore hageder. So I looked into this, which one is really the real meaning of ma'achore hageder. So it's interesting. In the Achronim, they interpret ma'achore hageder that he's on one side of the fence and she's on the other side of the fence. But in earlier poskim, up to the Rishonim, Rabbi Al-Madri writes this, ma'achore hageder means no, in a hidden spot. The issue is, looking at different poskim, they use different expressions. Is the issue because he's going to hear her voice? Is that the problem? So we need to understand what the actual problem is. It's just an example of a term that could be used. I found it absolutely fascinating. The same term could be used, and everybody's convinced. I'm talking to people, one of them is convinced it means this, another one's convinced it means that. The Torah is arucha meretz mida. There's so many ways to interpret the Torah, shuvim panam la Torah, and that's just one example of those things.
Join the global halacha learning revolution of the Leman Yilmedu Institute and bring increased brachos into your home. For details about the various learning programs, visit our website, lemanyilmedu.com. That's LEMAANYILMEDU.com.